Welcome to this episode of Stanford Medicine X Live for Tuesday, May 6, 2014. This program is a weekly live recorded broadcast and tweet chat from the organizers of Stanford Medicine X, a conference that explores the intersection of emerging technology and medicine. The views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are those of the individual participants and not necessarily those of the Stanford University School of Medicine or the conference organizers. If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there's a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Sarah Kucharski, also known as Afternoon Napper, is the moderator of today's episode and will be taking questions from social media, so please make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX. We also wish to remind you that registration for Medicine X 2014 is now open. Don't miss the year's premier patient-centered conference on emerging technology and medicine. Unique opportunities such as our masterclass program and our IDEO Design Challenge workshop have extremely limited space availability. You'll want to take advantage of these programs while our regular registration pricing is still available until August 1st, 2014. Please note you are watching a live online program and there's a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-studio guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream. The topic of today's program for May 6, 2014 is Patient-Generated Data. Is it the future of healthcare? With us today is a diverse panel of patients and technology innovators with insights into patient data and healthcare. The goal of this program is to hear from them, have them share with us their views on these issues, and of course to answer your questions out there from our viewing audience on Twitter.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us at another episode of Stanford Medicine X Live. We have an exciting and super incredible, great panel here to discuss patient-generated health data and whether or not this is the future of healthcare. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff here in the next hour, and I'm going to jump right into the introduction so that we get to meet our panel. So we have with us tonight Carlos Rodarte from Patients Like Me. Carlos is the Director of Business Development and Wearables at Patients Like Me. Carlos oversees strategic partnerships with various stakeholders across healthcare. They're interested in learning more about how patient-reported data can provide insights into how patients live and how patients manage their disease. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Patients Like Me. In addition, Carlos is also helping identify and define the role that consumer-accessible wearables and biosensor technologies play in the context of disease management. We also have with us tonight Kathy Kim. Dr. Catherine Kim is a visiting assistant professor at the Beth Irene Moore School of Nursing at UC Davis. Her research centers on the role of technology in consumer and patient engagement in health and technology-enabled care models, with a particular focus in mobile health and social networks, distributed research networks, and health information exchange. Kathy co-leads the Patient and Consumer Engagement Task Force for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORNet, and the Federal Advisory Patient Empowerment Workshop to the Office of the National Coordinator of Health IT. Kathy has been at this for 20 years. And she has experience in healthcare as a hospital, clinic, and medical group manager, as an entrepreneur, and she's got plenty of things to discuss with us tonight. Kathy received her PhD with a focus on health informatics at UC Davis, and a master's in public health and an MBA from UC Berkeley, and a BA in biology from Harvard. We also have with us tonight one of our patients, Doug Cantor. Doug is a patient with type 1 diabetes. He is also a designer, a self-quantifier, and he's founder of Databetes. Databetes, which I encourage you to check out, databetes.com, develops software to help diabetes patients better manage their condition by aggregating both medical and lifestyle data, such as exercise and nutrition. We also have with us tonight Anna McAllister-Slip. Anna is a co-founder of Galileo Analytics, which is a visual data exploration and data analytics company focused on helping people make sense of complex health data. Anna is a health IT entrepreneur. She's also a patient advocate, and like Doug, she's also a type 1 diabetic. Anna believes that digital health and medical devices are the key to empowering and engaging patients with chronic disease. And she has urged device manufacturers and policymakers to prioritize human factors design, to adopt standardized data formats, and to enable device and data interoperability. This is kind of a particularly interesting topic for me. She lives in Washington, D.C. We also have another patient, Jana Minassian. Jana is a patient living with lupus and other autoimmune diseases. She is the founder and facilitator of an in-person support group in Southern California for people with arthritis, lupus, fibromyalgia, and other autoimmune diseases. Jana works really hard to educate and to empower individuals with different forms of chronic illness. We also have with us Janet Freeman Daly, yet another e-patient. Janet is a Pacific Northwest native. She's a retired aerospace engineer. She's a writer, a science geek with degrees from MIT and from Caltech. She is also a metastatic lung cancer patient who has been kept alive thanks to a clinical trial. And I'm sure by thanks to her engagement and her fierceness, I suppose I can say. She uses her skills to translate the experience and science of lung cancer treatment and research into language that other patients and their caregivers can understand. She's also a blogger and a co-founder of Lung Cancer and Social Media, hashtag LCSM, and she's one of our Medicine X e-patient delegates for this year. And we also have Julia Bernstein of Ginger.io. Julia drives strategy and business development efforts at Ginger.io, a startup that's focused on taking big and small data from smartphone sensors to drive better health. Previously, Julia was a healthcare consultant at the Boston office of McKinsey & Company. She has also worked for the e-commerce startup Citrus Lane. Julia has received her applied baccalaureate from Dartmouth College and her MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Now I think I need a sip of water after all these introductions of all these accomplished people. And I think we can just jump right into it. And hopefully, I think maybe we can start from sort of the very, very beginning, sort of defining what is patient-generated health data. And perhaps Kathy can help us with kind of setting up for us. What is, Kathy, patient-generated health data? And if you can, give us some examples of PGHD, I suppose that's how we call it in the business.
Absolutely, I'm happy to do that. So I think of patient-generated health data as any data that's relevant to health that individuals are either generating or collecting and transmitting them for other purposes. So I think, people sometimes think patient-generated health data is, lifestyle information, physical fitness, activity, foods that you're tracking, the things that we sort of think about in terms of wellness and fitness. But I think that's only one set of patient-generated health data. The other is what's actually often used in clinical settings, a patient history, a family history, reporting of symptoms and signs, and those kinds of things are used extensively in the clinical setting. Those are also patient-generated health data. So I think of it very broadly in terms of anything that patients or other individuals are creating and collecting and sharing that's relevant to health, whether that's to the clinical setting or to their own individual lives.
There's another aspect of clinical data that's useful, the side effects that patients are experiencing when they're on treatment during clinical trials, very useful information, and also being able to track what treatments are working for you if you have a specific type of disease.
Right. That's a really interesting point, Janet, and which kind of is a perfect segue, even though we did not rehearse this, but it's a perfect segue for another question I have that perhaps Kathy can also kind of explain a little bit. I know, Kathy, that you were involved with Project Health Design, and Project Health Design defined one type of data called observations of daily living, and ODL. Is what Janet is talking about, does that qualify as observations of daily living? And what is the difference between, why observations of daily living, and why not just say patient-generated health data? Is that because it's a mouthful, I suppose? Oh, Kathy, you're muted.
Let me unmute myself. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay. So Project Health Design was a set of projects that were funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as a group. There were 5 projects, and we were all working on projects to incorporate mobile health and to use this concept of observations of daily living to improve the collaboration of patients with clinicians and to improve the process of care. So ODLs, or observations of daily living, were defined as the things that patients or individuals, if they're not actually in a clinical treatment process, see about their own lives. So they might be thoughts, feelings, sensations, experiences, but they're things that individuals see on a daily basis that, again, can have some relevance to their own health or to what clinicians need in terms of a treatment process. So those ODLs can take many, many forms. So ODLs in our projects were things like, what foods are you eating, what kinds of physical activity are you getting, what symptoms are you feeling and experiencing, what's the context around you, what's the environment around you, what are some of what are moods, what are you observing. There was one project that was related to premature babies, and that project was actually observing what came out in the diaper. So all of those things have some relevance to health. So those are observations of daily living as Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Project Health Design actually defined it. So some of those are clearly patient-generated health data. But I think PGHD is, again, a much broader set of information than just the observations that individuals have that are relevant to them. And as Janet mentioned, they are sometimes very clinically relevant pieces of information, like signs and symptoms, like side effects, like the impact of different doses of medications. All of those things are very clinically relevant and are patient-generated for the most part.
Right. So what we're trying to get here, hopefully at the end of this hour that we're here together, we're hopefully we can sort of determine or decide or discuss whether or not patient-generated health data is the future of healthcare, and hopefully you guys can help us take it apart and kind of understand whether or not it is the future of healthcare, because patient-generated health data presumes or expects that patients collect data or provide some input into the system. Isn't that right? So I don't know, for anybody who wants to chime in, and I don't know. So what is so? I suppose we could talk about, you know, both. I don't want to leave it around just Kathy and Janet, but I suppose it's interesting this point about research and about you know, data that is collected. You know, here's one thing that's important to point out. I think in 2011, at the American Medical Informatics Association, an expert projected that within 5 years, the majority of clinically relevant data would be collected outside of clinical settings. It's been, what, 3 years now, and so there are folks here that I know aren't really self-trackers or are somewhere in between the spectrum. So what do you think of that? I'll send it back to you, Kathy. Sorry, but what do you think?
I can certainly. Yeah, I can kick off the discussion on this one. I think that patient-generated health data is the now of healthcare as well as the future of healthcare, because so much of our health, you know, the impact on our health happens throughout the day and throughout the night when you're asleep. It doesn't happen when you're in a clinical setting. So if we were really to limit our knowledge of health and our knowledge of medical care to what happens when you're in a clinical setting, we're talking about a tiny slice of your day. So the things that really make a difference in your health are what you do the rest of the day. So I think it already is what we need now, but we need ways to collect it. We need ways to make sense of it so that it can be analyzed and made useful and actionable, but to both individuals and to clinicians, and we need it to really be made accessible to people so that they can use it in the way that's going to be most impactful for themselves. I think with quantified self-trackers, as well as with community-based programs in public health, that information really needs to be widely accessible. And that's where we need to get. That's where the technology needs to come in to actually help us to do that. But I think the patient-generated health data is what's completely relevant right now for us to improve our healthcare system.
Hugo, this is Anna, and I would like to just say that this is one of my great frustrations, I think, with all of the money that we're spending on installing electronic health records in all of our hospitals. I think that's an essential first step, but one of the biggest issues that we have in dealing with chronic disease of any kind is the fact that the healthcare system is institution-based. It's designed around issues related to acute care, not chronic care. So even though we've got all this incredible health IT investment happening, that investment is just reinforcing the acute care model that's been in place and causing issues for quite some time. That's why it's absolutely critical. That's why I've been a very strong and vocal advocate for the inclusion of a requirement for incorporating patient-generated health data into meaningful use stage 3. It's absolutely critical. Otherwise, I mean, we're missing a massive, expensive, incredible opportunity to get data that's far more valuable for those of us who have type 1 diabetes and other diseases into our electronic health record system.
Hugh, it's Julia. I want to build on something Kathy mentioned, which is that as patients and as people in need of healthcare, it's about as much about the tools that are accessible to us for collecting that data. And you know, if you look at the tools that are now available, from apps that collect active data on the smartphone to apps that collect passive data like Ginger.io and like Facebook Just Buying Moves, which is the step count data, to more and more of the technology that's coming out that allows individuals to contribute their health data outside of the doctor's office, Kathy, as you mentioned. So tools like the AliveCore ECG, Propeller Health, which just received FDA clearance for its asthma data collection and control tool today. I think it's really exciting to see the proliferation of those tools, and both to Anne's point as well as to Kathy's point, a lot of those tools are starting to be integrated more and more into platforms that provide that information back to a caregiver or a clinician who can actually make them make them a part of care. So I think it is the future, and I think it's a question of the tools that are being adopted now by early adopters becoming part of mainstream care, and a question of us building the platforms that bring that data into care as well.
But for those of us who have type 1 diabetes, I've been a quantified selfer for well long before that term was ever invented. I mean, I've been collecting data and generating data every day, multiple times a day, 24/7 with my diabetes devices of various sorts for 28 years at this point. And none of that has ever been captured. I still can't get that data in any kind of usable format for myself to be able to use. In addition to my continuous glucose monitor, my blood glucose meter, my insulin pump, I also use a Fitbit, I use a blood pressure monitor, I use a digital scale, I use a variety of different iPhone applications. All of this generates incredibly valuable data. None of it makes it to my physician. And at the end of the day, it's really not about getting data to my physician. It's about making it useful and integratable for me, because I'm the one that makes the decisions about my insulin dosing on a regular basis. But if we're going to be developing outcomes measures that actually matter and are actually fine-tuned to look for things that are really important for those people with chronic disease especially, we need to find a way to get all of this data integrated, be able to access it, and get it into our electronic health record data. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to get a significant enough aggregated pool of data to be able to do any real outcomes measures for things that really matter for people with chronic disease.
I'd like to speak on the aspects of clinical trial data. There is a huge amount of data generated in clinical trials, especially in targeted therapies. There are going to be so many new therapies coming down the pipeline, and all of them are generating large amounts of data. Interestingly, all of that is pretty much generated by the patient. When I go and see my doctor, my clinical trial appointment, I bring my notes of everything that happened to me during the month, and he has a list of questions he asks me, and I have a chance to tell him things, but he only still has 20 minutes to do all of it. And some of that information makes it back to the drug company who might be sponsoring my trial, and some of it is not considered important and gets dropped, but it's still a large volume of data coming out of the clinical trials. What's interesting is that patient-generated data might take more prevalence in clinical trials. There are people like me who have a mutation that's very rare, and we'll never get enough of us together to be able to do a phase 3 trial to get our drug approved. There are some people who would like to see the clinical trials modified so that people like me who are taking a drug that is already FDA approved for a different mutation can be allowed to take that drug in a clinical setting and let the clinicians collect all the data and have that submitted to be able to evaluate whether or not the drug is worth keeping. And again, that's all going to be patient-generated data, and we're going to need somewhere to collect it.
Right, that's a good point. Carlos, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Janet and Anna, I certainly agree with your positions here, and I think as we think about patient-generated data, I think what we can't forget is that it has to be patient-driven, and I think that's a really key distinction there to make, because oftentimes we're using established measures, we're using current technology, and then trying to apply that to a very particular human circumstance to better characterize and measure and understand a particular use case. But as we know, as we look at every individual, the specific needs of every individual, I think we have to first assess, what in fact is the need, and then think about the methodology that we use, the measurement that we use. And I think, certainly clinical trials, certainly, current wearables and biosensors can give us a bigger window into the human API that is our bodies and constantly generating information. But I think we have to take a step back and really think about what is needed in the context of a very specific either clinical case or development case, if it's for clinical trials, and then sort of go back to basics and then think about what that methodology begins to look like.
Right. Wow. So yeah. Well, so we're right into the topic. So, so this is great. Well, let's take a moment. Let's take just one quick little break for a message from Dr. Chu, and we'll get right back into this. Just a moment.
Let's take a quick break to remind those of you just joining us for this episode of Stanford Medicine X Live that we are here with a panel of patients and innovators discussing the topic, patient-generated data. Is it the future of healthcare? This program is made possible by the Stanford University School of Medicine Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. Time to take a shout out to Twitter. If you are following this conversation online or on Twitter, Sarah Kucharski, also known as Afternoon Napper, is moderating the Twitter discussion on the Medicine X hashtag. We have with us today a panel of patients and providers. E-patients and caregivers out there, what questions do you have for our panelists today? Why do some patients with chronic disease choose to track and some do not? Healthcare providers, technologists, and researchers out there, how might tracking symptoms help innovate healthcare and technology? How might we engage our patients with chronic conditions to self-track their symptoms and work in partnership with their healthcare team? Tweet us your questions or responses, and we'll do our best to have the panel address them during this episode of Stanford Medicine X Live for Tuesday, May 6th, 2014.
And we're back. So let's talk about this for a second. So I know that there's a patient here among us on the panel, Jana, who is not much of a self-tracker, and I talked to her earlier before, and I don't know whether it's different in terms of depending on which condition you have. For example, perhaps diabetes require more of an engagement. Maybe what I have, a cardiac condition that makes me susceptible to cardiac arrhythmias, is something I can't really do anything about it, or perhaps I can. But Jana is a young arthritis patient who deals with constant pain, and Jana, as far as, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't get a sense that you track you're not always tracking your pain or your symptoms, right? And so I wanted to hear from you and kind of get a sense of why is that, and why aren't all patients with autoimmune conditions self-tracking?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, actually. There are several things that people with autoimmune disease can track, people with chronic illness. One of them could be your fatigue, obviously your pain, your sleep, and the reason I personally don't track is because it's depressing. You know, when you're in constant pain and you have to look at some sort of chart that's telling you, yep, I'm in a lot of pain, it's definitely a depressing thing. It's frustrating, especially when you can't maintain the level that you're trying to maintain. When you have no control, it's very frustrating. When you're in constant pain, you have to acknowledge it. Very difficult.
From the cancer patient viewpoint, there's a couple of reasons why people may not track. One, as Jenna was saying, the person may not feel healthy enough. They may not care about data if they can barely get up off the sofa.
Yeah.
But the other is, especially when you've got a seriously ill patient who might be looking at a very short lifespan, they may not want to be confronted with that aspect of their illness. They may not want to acknowledge their diagnosis. If you're tracking data, you've got it smacking you in the face every day that you may not have much time. And so some people just choose not to do that.
I actually have something to add to that. Another problem that not only myself but people in my support group have encountered is if they are tracking, bringing that information to their doctors and their doctors not responding to it, either not acknowledging it or not using it in terms of their care. So that's become a problem of okay, I can track it for myself, but when it's time to bring it to your doctor to try to get more of a wellness plan, they just don't have the time or don't know what to do with it.
Right, and I suppose that's why folks with diabetes, there are, and I know Doug is the extreme end of the spectrum, you know, having tracked meticulously all his, I suppose, dietary data and blood glucose levels, insulin, and created this incredible, amazing graphic about it. But there are people who don't really track their blood glucose levels. Doug, what would you, either Doug or Anna or anybody who has some insight into why do some people with diabetes don't really bother to track their blood glucose level? Is that because they don't want to be depressed because it's too high?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different levels, a lot of different reasons why people might not track, and type 1s have different needs and often test a lot more than type 2s. Type 2s sometimes only test even once a day. They don't have the same amount of volatility in their blood sugars. And I think people also just go through different stages in their life. I think people are at times ready to really deal with the consequences of it more at other times. You know, I know when I was in college, I was testing a lot less than I am now. But no, it's also a lot of type 2 patients or have comorbidities, so they're handling a whole wide variety of issues simultaneously, and sometimes they just feel overwhelmed. But, you know, to build on some of Anna's points, I think that if the systems that were out there were better in terms of being able to bring this data in a much more reliable fashion, that a lot more people would be tracking than currently are.
Yeah, and I think, this is Anna, I think that's absolutely critical what Doug just said. Doug did a quantified self project and created some beautiful images that he made with his data, but it took a lot of work for him to and he's a technical expert and a computer programmer and a computer artist, and it took a lot of work for him to collect that data and integrate it and access it in a way that it was going to be usable. I mean, Doug has skills that the vast majority of us with type 1 do not have. There are elements, I mean, I'm pretty nerdy and I'm pretty, I don't think I'm as extreme or as focused as Doug is in terms of being willing to try to integrate all of the data and turn it into a beautiful picture. But there are things that I would track more consistently, such as activity levels and mood levels or energy levels, if I could get all of the data in one place. I mean, the way it works now, it's very difficult to find any patterns amongst all of this data because it's all in completely different data formats. It's in completely different platforms. It just really isn't useful. And for us to be able to make it useful, we need to be able to get it integrated into a single platform so that we can see how all of the patterns of the various data streams interact and how that matters. That would be incredibly, incredibly useful for me as somebody who has not just type 1, but also has all of the complications of diabetes, such as kidney disease, nerve disease, eye disease, chronic kidney disease-related anemia. I mean, it's incredibly important and useful information for me as I make decisions about whether I'm going to walk or how much insulin I'm going to take or whether or not I need to skip the gym. But I just can't use it the way that it could be used because all of the data is stuck in various proprietary platforms. In terms of why people don't track, I mean, in addition to what I just said about some of the things that I don't track, when I was first diagnosed, I would go through periods where type 1, you kind of cycle in and out of periods where you're more engaged and less engaged. It's a lifetime disease, and sometimes it can be difficult to sort of get your head around all of it, and it can be a real challenge, and you know, it's a lot of work. Sometimes you're willing to admit that it's a lot of work, and sometimes you're not, and that's something that happens with a lot of people when they're first diagnosed.
Right, and so it's kind of, it brings up an interesting point. Can we learn a lot what can we learn from our data without context? Or do we really need context to really kind of make sense of it? And and I wanted to hear perhaps from Julia or from Carlos or even Kathy, or whoever wants to chime in. So what can be inferred from patient-generated health data without context? Anything at all? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, context, I think, means a lot of different things with different types of data. And what's been really interesting for us is we're talking about, in this conversation, an individual's data at an individual's level. And what we found at Ginger.io is that when you're able to look at an individual's data in the context of what you've learned about a population of people who may look similar in terms of condition, diagnoses, behavior, is with just a bare bones information on that patient, you can map them to a greater population and actually learn quite a bit about them. So it's been really interesting for us to take some of the data that we collect from a smartphone sensor around movement, communication, and other types of behavior, which may fit in that LDL category or may actually be able to become patient-generated health data through analytics, and look at patterns and say, for instance, we've seen a change in an individual's call patterns. All we may know about that individual is they've been diagnosed with psychosis. But if we compare that individual to our understanding of the population, we can actually glean quite a lot around how they're doing. So I think it's really a question of, what data are you collecting, and then how do I think Anna and Kathy's points, are you analyzing and working with that data to try to glean something useful and to make it actionable. So we've found that to be really interesting. But to return to it, I think this idea of context is important in the sense that a lot of these individual data streams, without context onto how a patient is living their daily life, what's going on for that patient, how they're behaving, what their mood, what their energy is, in absence, these data streams do sometimes feel a little bit weak, which is why you need multiple data streams and why you need context both on the individual and on the population level to start to turn it into actionable data that can be used by a patient or by a clinician they're working with.
Absolutely, Julia. I could not agree more with you. I think certainly looking at context is primordial here as we look at how actionable the data is, and I think really thinking about what context enables. I think is a really interesting question, and I think for different patient segments or individual patients, it's going to mean different things. The context may be something that gives meaning to self-tracking, something that gives meaning to the clinical encounter. It can give context to and actionability to many things. But I think part of the beauty of what Patients Like Me is enabling currently is to, as patients report data about themselves over time, longitudinally, they're able to look at percentile bands of how they reside in context to other members like them, and then really be able to have conversations that are about data, data-driven discussions about what led to the tracking, what led to the outcome, what more can be done. But one thing that we haven't discussed yet, and I think this is important, is context enables us to really begin to develop prediction models and really begin to sort of think about, for people like me in this status, and given what can be characterized about the individual and the set of variables, can we begin to infer probability paths about the unique patient's future that may be informed by data within the context of patients like them or patients that are actually slightly dissimilar to them, just because it may glean some useful insights. But I think thinking about context and what it enables is just as important.
Yeah, I think, Carlos, it's a great point about predictive analytics, and I think that's where all of this is going if, as everyone's pointed out, we can liberate the data and get it onto the same platform for analytics. But the other thing I'll add is we talk a lot about context, but I think it's context for whom. Is it context for a patient who's looking to adapt how they're living their daily life, understand what makes their pain worse, or understand how their insulin working? Or is it context for a clinician who's managing a relationship with many patients and trying to make things work together? Or is it context for a loved one who's involved in a patient's care? So I think it's not just a question of context, but it's a question of context for whom and for what purpose, and that how we leverage this data, that actionable use of data and these analytics to really make things better.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And what I wanted to chime in and talk about was this is where researchers and patients working together can really make an impact. Because when we have clinical trials, when we have other kinds of research studies, right, we get the answer that is an average over everybody that was in the study. And then when you actually get out into the real world, into patients' homes and where they work, and even in practices and hospitals, we never replicate those results. We never get those results from clinical trials because now you're in the real world and there are lots of other contextual factors that come in. things are not controlled and things, people are not following a specific protocol. They're actually living their lives. And so maybe we need a different model of research where we're taking the context into account as we do the research, because that's where it's going to end up. And so I think context is really important as part of that discussion. And I think of things like the N of 1 trials, where people are doing experimentation, but it's actually done as a research study, so that you can then aggregate the information from lots of different people who've done the same N of 1 study, but on themselves, and you get very good, results from that. But we need to be looking at those kinds of models so we can make sure that when we have patient-generated data, when we're trying to answer some research questions, it'll be useful, but it'll be replicable, and it will actually work when people are living their lives.
There is another tie-in on that to research and patient-generated data. When clinical trials are over and a larger population of people start taking a particular drug, often more side effects are discovered that were reported in the clinical trial. And those are supposed to be reported and collected, but it's often left up to the provider, who may or may not have heard of it. So it would be useful for patients to be able to provide that information directly in some way. Also, there's another purpose of having this data collected. Sometimes the patients are giving it to their primary provider, but in the case of a lot of cancer patients, we need to go get second opinions. We need to be ready to get into clinical trials, and we generate a whole heck of a lot of data. So there needs to be some way to help us organize the fact that we've had 20 different scans and blood work every month for 2 years, and various biopsies, etc., and get that all together in a way that's portable, so that we can take it when we go to a different provider, rather than having to have a drawer full of materials at home that we sort through whenever we need to go see somebody else.
Right. Anna, you look like you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the critical elements of this is the data has to be available in a way that is easily accessible and viewable and usable by the patient or the clinician. And right now, even for those of us who have type 1 diabetes, which in many respects is sort of the leading edge of outpatient, clinically relevant devices that generate data. I mean, we've been, as I said previously, we've been doing this for a very long time. But the data isn't accessible in a way that anybody can do anything with it. For instance, there are people who are working to use, I use a continuous glucose monitor, which I'll hold up as show and tell, which generates data about my diabetes 24/7. Every 3 minutes it gets beamed into this receiver and I can see it. But I can't actually access those raw data files very easily. It doesn't work on an Apple computer. It's difficult to download. You have to sort through and put it into all sorts. I mean, it's incredibly complex. If I want to donate that data so that a researcher can actually use it, it's incredibly difficult. And in some cases, the device manufacturers they make you sign something that gives them ownership of the data, so that you relinquish the ownership of your own body's data. So getting access to this data in a way that's usable is going to be incredibly important if we're ever going to be able to get enough aggregated data to be able to put things in a broader context, so that it's not just for one individual, but it's for an entire population, so that we can begin understanding patterns. There are people who are attempting to develop outcomes measures especially for type 1 diabetes, using continuous glucose monitor data. There are a couple of different candidate measures that are out there, but it's incredibly difficult because just accessing enough of the data that patients are generally willing to donate is impossible. I mean, it's just very, very difficult. And that's in large part because the device manufacturers are choosing to make it difficult. And that is something that we could fix and that we need to fix immediately. It's just an issue of, are they willing to make it available in a way that's usable, where the patients own it, they can see it, and they can do with it what they want. And I know that's a big issue for you as well, Yuko.
Tell me about it. Right. So how close are we to? So here's the question. So how is, I know that the ONC, the Office of National Coordinator of Health IT, and I don't know who can answer this, But the Office for National Coordinator of Health IT is looking into ways of incorporating patient-generated health data into meaningful use, stage 3. So how are we getting close to having data incorporated into the electronic medical record? Is this for Anna, for Kathy, for? Well, I'll let you guys fight over it. I don't know.
I can just make a really brief comment because I was on the task force that actually took this topic on, and I think ONC really has a hard task where they're trying to deal with almost a very narrow activity, which is electronic health records, and do we get patient-generated data into electronic health records? And when you're dealing with the commercial sector and then a wide variety of what personal health data, patient-generated health data is, trying to fit that into some sort of standard that makes it into an EHR is very complicated, or not complicated. It's a difficult thing to get consensus on. So I think the strategy and the recommendation that we made as the task force to ONC was really that if we're going to limit this to EHR, make it something reasonable that EHR vendors can do in the short term on the kinds of data that we already have agreement on. So it's not going to be most of patient-generated health data. It's going to be a limited set. And I think under a regulatory framework, you'd rather have their reach be limited rather than try to regulate something on a very broad basis.
Kathy, that point on sort of the regulatory bodies and their role, I think, is a really interesting one to begin to tackle, because I think we're having a lot of conversations about patient-driven and patient-reported data, but I think what ultimately we need to be asking ourselves, what would it take, or what would you have to believe for it to be applied in the settings where we know it should resonate? What is it going to take to be clinically integrated? What is it going to take for it to be part of the development process in clinical trials? And I think the harsh truth is that I think it has to have a direct economic impact. And I think right now it's oftentimes looked upon as a nice to have, and as something that is trying to be put into a system that just historically hasn't been able to deal with the type of information, but certainly the standardization process that needs to occur for it to be actionable. But I think as we think about this, what will it require to for patient-generated data to be successful is, what are those specific use cases that will help drive economics behind some sort of activity, and how do you begin to quantify that?
Yeah, and one thing I'll add there, Carlos, to that point about what are the use cases and what does this landscape look like, is it's not just the government kind of driving it through regulation. I think you're seeing more and more public-private or nonprofit-private partnership on this idea of freeing the data. One I'll highlight is OpenM Health, which is Ida Sims from UCSF and Deborah Estrin from Cornell Tech, and they've done a number of these demonstration projects around PTSD is one use case where combining data and using analytics from different devices can have a real impact. But they're also really focused on can you come up with these standards and work on these integration pilots from the integration or from the private side as well as the government. So I think it's we're going to need the government to do it on a large scale, but I think there are a lot of examples coming from the nonprofit and the academic side as well as from the private side that can help us make progress and be an example of the use cases and how this gets done.
This is Ina. I just wanted to say that this is something that's incredibly doable. Maybe you don't require all patient-generated health data from the outset, but again, speaking somewhat selfishly based on my personal experience, those of us with type 1 diabetes, again, have lots of data. It's generated. People understand it. It's incredibly clinically relevant. For the most part, it would be relatively easy to just be able to export it into a standard data format that could be easily integrated into the EHR. Where we currently are is we're spending $30 billion for meaningful use to make our electronic, or to make our hospital systems and our healthcare system electronic. Absolutely critical, very needed. But all of the different things that are focused on patient needs along the way have been fought tooth and nail by the industry sectors that are involved with it, whether they're the hospital systems or the electronic health record vendors. Everybody says it's too difficult, it's too challenging. Currently, I get most of my medical care at a very prestigious academic health center in downtown Washington, D.C. And my endocrinologist, I've actually just changed because, in part because of this reason, they couldn't even download my continuous glucose monitor data, not to be integrated into my EHR, just to be able to see it. So they have received, I don't know how much money, but they're part of the meaningful use process. They have something called the Biomedical Informatics Innovation Center, which has received ONC grant, like challenge grant money. But even though the software to download my CGM data is free and has been available for free to institutions as well as patients for a year and a half at this point, the IT department within that hospital system has chosen not to install it. That's where we are right now. Everybody knows what to do, who's an endocrinologist, knows what to do with clinical, with continuous glucose monitor and medical device data. They just can't get it. They can't even see it because the hospital system has deprioritized the need for a very visible, very data-centric chronic disease. And they've deprioritized the needs of patients and the needs of clinicians and have chosen to focus on other things. Now, I think a lot of them would argue they're focusing on other elements that are more critical for meaningful use and that will enable their hospital to be able to get their meaningful use incentives. Let's give them an incentive because this is critical. And maybe you don't have to go with all diseases all over the place, but begin somewhere. And I think diabetes would be a very easy one. Cardiovascular disease would be a very easy one. It isn't happening now, and it absolutely has to. It will be a shame if we spend 30 billion taxpayer dollars to recreate an acute care hospital and healthcare system. It's criminal given where we are with mobile health and the promise of digital health, and it's incredibly frustrating to me as somebody who lives in downtown DC and understands all the things that are going on that this is being allowed to happen.
Wow. Wow. So yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. I think I wish I lived in DC so I could be in front of the White House with signs all day, asking to liberate our data and asking for all these things. Unfortunately, we're sort of getting to the end of our. I feel like we're only like scratching the surface of this topic. We could talk about this stuff for hours. But I wanted to ask a question from Twitter. I've been really bad, and I apologize to our Twitter followers that I haven't been asking any of the Twitter questions because we've been so engaged here. But I wanted to ask. There's a question here. It came in a while ago, and the question comes from Dr. Aaron Gray, and I wanted to ask this question of the patients who are present here. And Dr. Aaron Gray asks, how would you feel if you were asked to fill out online automated questions based on the reason for your visit prior to your visit? So I don't know. I'll send it. How would you guys? Anybody? Any takers? How would you feel about again? How would you feel if you're asked to fill out online automated questions based on the reason for your visit prior to the visit?
Well, I can go initially. This is actually happening not online, but over the phone. When I call into my local clinic and I want to make an appointment with a general provider as unrelated to my cancer, they ask the purpose of the visit, and then they ask if there's another purpose of the visit. So at one point I asked them why they were doing that, and it's because they have to know which code to bill it to. And if you give them 2 codes, you'll get billed for 2 different visits. So part of me thinks if I'm asked a question to fill out a form online, it's like, what pigeonhole are they going to put me in if I ask this data? If it helps them be more efficient, that's great, but I'd still want the doctor to listen to what I have to say in addition to what I've submitted online.
Just to jump in and actually expand the question a little bit, Hugh, I would actually ask, what about between visits, after visits, and all the different touch points where you might be providing information to the doctor on how they're doing? So I'd be curious for patients on the panel, given what Janet's saying about pigeonholing, but given the conversation we're having about the importance of this data, if it's liberated and used in the right way, how far would you expand that willingness to answer questions?
I'm willing to chime in on that. I mean, I feel like a lot of those questions that you could be answers are sort of data services that you'd have to build on top of the data. You know, building on Carlos's point earlier, I think there's so much potential here once the data is available to improve care and to help patients. But if this data is locked down, then none of these things are possible. I think a lot of this stuff is trying to make best use of those precious few minutes with your doctor, and with a good flow of data, that would definitely be possible.
Right. So, wow. Okay. I'm not sure, we're running out of time here. I'm not sure how much time do we have. If we have still a few minutes for a few more questions. But here's another question that I believe came from Twitter. So how do you move beyond the collection to enable patients to act on the info they gain? And I'm not sure I understand. So I suppose the question is, having data and acting on the data are two separate things. How do you move beyond collection of data to enable patients to act on the information that they gain? Any takers on that? Maybe Jana or anyone?
I'm happy to take it. I mean, from my perspective, which is somewhat myopically focused on diabetes with associated complications, I could act on the data and do act on the data already. So all I want is for all of it to be integrated and in one place so that I can see the multiple trend lines from the various devices that are generating data that I'm using. I mean, there are people who are working on interesting analytical tools and algorithms that would be able to do predictive analytics around glucose measures, and that's fine, that's great. That's step 2. From my perspective, step 1 is we got to get it all in one place in a usable format so that you can see everything together. Okay. On that note, I think we're going to wrap it. You guys have been wonderful. I'm so happy to have had you guys here with us for this hour. You guys are wonderful. Just I wish we were sitting around a table with beers in our hands. This would last hours and hours. So, but unfortunately, we have to wrap. We have to end this, and I ask you for you guys who are watching us out there to join us again next week for another Medicine X Live on Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. Until next time, thank you very much. See you then.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight for this episode of Stanford Medicine X Live. We'll see you back here on May 13th, 2014 at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time when we'll discuss the topic E-Patient Leadership, Mentoring Others. You won't want to miss this next episode of Stanford Medicine X Live. As a reminder, this program is made possible by support from the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. If you haven't yet done so, please take a moment to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX so you can continue the conversation online and stay informed of program updates. From all of us here at Stanford Medicine X, we want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to join us again this Thursday, May 8th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for another edition of Stanford Medicine X Live featuring a new healthcare design class from the Stanford University School of Medicine called Design for Health. This week, we are featuring Jennifer Kurkowski, People Analytics Manager at Google, on designing for health in the workplace. For all of you out there taking time to tune in with us tonight, thank you for joining us and being part of the conversation. Don't forget that registration for Medicine X 2014 is now open. Don't miss the year's premier patient-centered conference on emerging technology and medicine. Unique opportunities such as our masterclass program and our IDEO Design Challenge workshop have extremely limited space availability. You'll want to take advantage of these programs and register to reserve your spot today. A special thanks to our guest panelists this evening. From all of us at Medicine X, we'll see you next time.